Insect-resistant corn varieties known as BT have been available in the U.S. since 1996. Farmers have used that seed to help control insects like rootworms. U.S. growers planted only 8% of their corn to a BT variety in 1997, but that number has significantly risen. Producers in 2015 used BT corn on 81% of U.S. corn acres. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension entomologist Bob Wright about rootworm resistance that's now developing in states such as Nebraska. We started by asking how widespread the resistance is.
We've been doing work in the entomology department the last couple of years, and other entomologists in other states like Iowa have documented now that there are some populations of rootworms that have measurable levels of resistance to 2 of the 4 BT proteins that are used in corn hybrids now. And so we found rootworm populations basically across the state that have some level of resistance, not every field in a county or an area, but pockets of resistance from northeast Nebraska to southwest Nebraska. So it's pretty widespread geographically, but in a particular county, not every field is going to have a problem. It depends a lot on the past history of cropping in that area and what type of hybrids they've been planting.
To what extent can that resistance cause significant damage?
Well, it can definitely have an effect, because if you're only relying on the BT hybrids to control rootworms and you're growing corn after corn repeatedly, rootworm populations will build up, and they can be high enough to cause economic damage or lodging if you're not using other supplemental control measures.
So what does a grower need to ask themselves to determine if they might have a problem?
Yeah, we can't survey every field. It's a pretty long, laborious process to really detect or confirm that we have resistance. And we've been doing work the last several years, but there's some things for growers to ask themselves. You know, higher risk factors for problems with rootworms would be if you grow corn after corn repeatedly, if you grow the same type of BT hybrid that expresses only one active protein against rootworms, that's a risk factor. There are hybrids now that have 2 proteins that are effective against rootworms, and those are less likely to have resistance develop. And then if you're using other control measures as well, that can reduce the risk for problems showing up by suppressing populations.
How necessary is crop rotation?
Well, it's the most effective management practice we have for rootworms. I know with economics, a lot of people don't want to grow corn or rotate corn every other year, but the general recommendation, if you can rotate at least every 3rd year, that can really help keep rootworm populations down to a lower level.
So is the recommendation then not to rely on a single treatment, whether it be insecticide or a specific BT variety?
Right. Using a diversity of tactics is really important in resistance management. We've had past instances of insecticide resistance in Nebraska with rootworms, so whether it's an insecticidal protein in the BT corn or an insecticide that's applied, we don't want to do the same thing repeatedly, and that's where we've had problems before. And interestingly, with the BT hybrids, there's evidence that even as few as 3 continuous years of using the same single trait can lead to resistance development, or it has happened, been documented.
How concerning is that level of how quickly they can adapt?
Well, that's one thing that's really curious or interesting about rootworms. They have adapted to a lot of our control practices in the past. So we want to be aware of that when we try to manage rootworms, is not to do the same thing repeatedly, because they probably will get around it eventually.
All right, coming up in January, crop production clinics, you'll be presenting on this topic. Tell me what you'll be presenting about specifically.
Well, there's a new information on a website developed by or maintained by the National Corn Growers Association that has some decision tools and questions that growers can ask themselves to determine their risk for resistance development, and then depending on the level of risk, what type of management practices would be appropriate. And their first recommendation is similar to ours, is that crop rotation is the most important thing, to either rotate different types of BT traits or use hybrids that have 2 proteins that are active against rootworms if you have problems with rootworms. Having high populations of rootworms doesn't necessarily mean that you have resistance, but it is still something you need to manage. You need to change practices to reduce the rootworm populations.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to that National Corn Growers Association website Bob mentioned that contains resources on rootworm management practices. We'll also put a link on our homepage to more information about the 2016 crop production clinics, which will take place at 9 locations in January.